Well, hello and welcome to The Point. Whether you're at The Point at 9 o'clock for Morning Point or 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon for Point 123, welcome to you. Or if you're at home watching, then we're glad to see you. And if you're watching in Tanzania, then Jambo to you. You're welcome to watch these videos at any time and you can download them from www.thepoint.life. At the moment, we're looking through the book of Romans, so let's see at the start where Romans fits in the New Testament. So I put the books of the New Testament on the screen. You'll see that at the top there are the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Then there's Acts, the story of the church. And then below, in blue, are what we call the epistles, the letters. And these are not in alphabetical order or even in date order. These are in order of size. So the largest is Romans, followed by 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, and then Galatians. And each one is in size order, and they put the biggest one at the start, and I think it's also the most important one. Because Romans, I think, is the most important letter ever written. It's written by St. Paul, one of the first Christian leaders, and it's written to the people at Rome, a place he's never been. For the other letters, he's writing to places he's been before usually and saying, don't forget when I came to you last I did this, that and the other. But when he's writing to the Romans, he's writing to people he's never seen before. So this is a general letter for all people in all times at all places, because it's an almost to whom it may concern kind of letter. And Paul writes to both Jews and Gentiles. Gentiles are people who are not Jewish. For the last few weeks we've been looking at the Jews and how Paul says don't think you're anything special because you started off Jewish. But in case the Gentiles have missed out and thought that they weren't going to get a look in, today he says, if you're Gentiles, don't forget you are there by God's grace alone. Because remember, in Rome, everybody's looking down on everybody else. The Jews are looking down on those who aren't Jews, the Gentiles. The Roman citizens are looking down on those who aren't citizens. Paul is both a Jew and a Roman citizen, and if anybody could look down on anybody, he could. But he tells them that they're not to look down on anybody. And this week, he specifically talks to the Gentiles. Paul saw himself as the apostle to the Gentiles. He particularly saw himself not as going to his own people, the Jews, and he saw that as something for Peter and Andrew and the other disciples. He saw it was his role as a Roman citizen, with a sort of insight into what outsiders were thinking, to share the gospel with those who weren't Jewish. And he felt he was particularly called to do that. And now he's using his credentials and saying, I'm the one who brings the gospel to the Gentiles, and I'm telling you that it's not something that you should be boasting about. Again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. These are the Jews that Paul's talking about here. He's been talking about in the earlier verses. Rather, because of their transgression, mistakes that the Jews made, not following Jesus, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? And Paul's saying, if the Jews going wrong and not following the way of God has led to the Gentiles being brought in, how much better will it be when the Jews are brought in fully and everything is done properly? How much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? But now he turns to the Gentiles. I am talking to you, Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I take pride in my ministry, in the hope I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. For if their rejection, that's the rejection of the Jews, brought reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. So the first fruits is a sort of technical term, and the bread that was offered, the dough that was offered at the start of the harvest, was called the first fruits. It was regarded as holy. So at the harvest festival, the Jews would give their very first bit of the crop to God. And what he's saying here is if the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, if the first people to follow God, the Jews, were holy, then the whole batch will be holy, because of course the yeast works through the whole dough. And the same way, if the root is holy, so are the branches. So if the Jewish people are holy, the people who are part of the branches, the people who are grafted on, the Gentiles, those who aren't Jewish, they too will be holy, because the root is secure. And then he goes on in Romans 11:17-21. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now sharing the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this: you do not support the root, but the root supports you. And Paul's using here the analogy of the olive tree and the idea of grafting in. And here's a picture from WikiHow about grafting, of how this is done. A small branch from one tree, a sapling, a little bit of a branch, is stuck into another tree and then tied up so that it takes its nourishment from that tree and is grafted on. Now, the image of the olive tree, the idea of the olive tree is the state of Israel. The people of Israel are often called in the Old Testament an olive tree. So the analogy is, to the original olive tree of Israel has been added the branches of the Gentiles. But they shouldn't feel special. They are just a branch. They are not the root. And Paul goes on. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted. Yes, that's true. But they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but tremble, for if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. So if God could get fed up with Israel and decide to bring in the Gentiles so that they could follow the way of God, then he might get fed up with the Gentiles. He might get fed up with those who said, well, we've been specially chosen now to be part of this people, God's people. Well, you too should tremble. You too should be humble, for God may well get fed up with you. Because God didn't get fed up with Israel just because they were Israel. He got fed up with them because they weren't following his ways. And we too fail to follow God's ways. It's only by his grace and by his love that we're accepted at all. So there is no place for arrogance in the Christian faith. No place for arrogance by race. No place for arrogance by learning, by tradition, by background. All Christians are by definition humble. This grafting on procedure has continued as Christianity has spread and grown, and every new culture it comes to, it grafts in that culture into the Christian church. So today Christians will be worshipping in different languages, different styles, different ways of doing things. In Britain, we tend to think of British Christianity as the norm, and everybody else as a variation of us. But that's not true at all, and we are just a tiny minority in the world church. Doesn't make us any less Christians that we don't worship in the normal way that most people do, but we are part of the church just the same. And at the point, we like to feel that we're a special part of the church in the way that St. Paul was, an apostle to the Gentiles, reaching out to those people who don't normally come to church. We hope we do that. If we're not doing it well, then please tell us and we'll try to do it better. But we are wanting to graft people in to God's kingdom, God's olive tree. And so we come to our questions. If you're at the point, you might want to find a table with a few people on it. The more people on at the table, the less likely you're going to have to be forced to say anything if you want to stay quiet. So feel free to just sit and listen and help yourself to tea and coffee. And if you want to join in, or you've got a different question, then fire away with those as well. If you're at home, well, you have the advantage that you can stop the video and do a bit of research. So my first question, are you a gardener? Have you ever grafted a branch onto a root, and what makes a graft take? I'm hoping that there's a few people at the point who are gardeners who'll be able to help the others. But if you're not, or if you're on your own and you're not, at least you'll be able to Google it and find out what the answers are. But number one is actually a sort of gardening question. Number two asks the question, why do you think Christianity has so many branches? There are lots and lots of different branches, and we often think the branch that we're on is either the correct one, or the most important, or the largest. As I said earlier, actually the branch that we're standing on is a very small branch compared to some of the enormous branches of world Christianity. Catholicism, the Orthodox Church, the Lutheran Church, lots of churches bigger than ours. But number three asks, what are your roots? Because if we've been grafted on to the church tree, where do our roots go back to? I think that's an interesting question, because obviously if we're not rooted in the source, then what we're growing isn't necessarily the right thing. So maybe you'd like to look at those questions. So if you're at home, pause the video, and if you're at the point, take a few moments and work together with your table to see what you come up with. Well, that's about all we've got time for this week. I hope those questions went well. Thank you very much for being here, or for listening at home, or in Tanzania. And we pray that you will find the thing we've talked about, helpful during this coming week. But for now, here are my takeaways, my thoughts on what we should do after having thought about these issues. Number one, we can't feel superior just because the Jews didn't listen and we did. The history of the Christian church has been littered with terrible anti-Semitism and disastrous persecution of the Jews because of this idea that somehow we are superior. And yet the whole point that Paul is making is that we are not. And we as olive branches can be thrown away at any time. We are not superior. Secondly, we should be grateful that God continues to graft new people and new cultures into the olive tree. Whether that's in this country or abroad, God wants everybody to follow him, and new cultures can be brought into the church of all different kinds. And it's fascinating that the church in Britain is now being evangelised by churches from abroad, as they see us as a mission field. And that's exactly right, for this country is a mission field, and our job is to help others be grafted in, to call others to follow Jesus. So those are my 3 takeaways for today, and now I'll ask the person in charge to finish with prayer.